An arrogant passenger mocked an older man until he realized it was Clint Eastwood. You won't believe how it ended. The hum of activity surrounded the boarding gate, for the early morning flight from Phoenix to Los Angeles passengers shuffled forward in neat lines, clutching coffee cups and carry-ons, their faces set with a mix of fatigue and purpose. It was a first-class boarding group, and the energy felt both exclusive and restrained. Among them was a man who stood out not just for his tailored navy suit or the polished leather shoes that gleamed under the terminal's fluorescent lights, but for the way he carried himself with an air of superiority that seemed to command attention. This man in his mid-40s had the look of someone who'd spent his life climbing corporate ladders, collecting accolades, and never doubting his place at the top. He wasn't here to simply fly. He was here to assert his dominance even among strangers. As he strolled toward the gate, his leather briefcase swinging in perfect rhythm with his steps, he glanced at the passengers around him with thinly veiled disinterest. Soon he was comfortably settled in his first-class seat, scrolling through emails on his tablet as other passengers filed in. That's when he noticed him, the older man who shuffled down the aisle carrying nothing but a small bag. The man wasn't dressed for first class, at least not by the businessman standards. A tan jacket, a plaid shirt, and a pair of worn loafers completed his look. His face, though weathered by time, held a certain calmness, like someone who had seen enough of life to be unaffected by trivialities. The older man moved quietly, settling into his seat with little fuss. He adjusted his jacket, placed his bag under the seat in front of him, and leaned back, gazing out the window. To most he might have seemed unremarkable, a picture of modesty and simplicity. But to the businessman, he was an anomaly. The younger man glanced at him, then at the flight attendant who was helping a few passengers find their seats with a sly grin. He leaned over just enough to ensure the older man could hear him. "Looks like first class isn't as exclusive as it used to be," he said with a smirk. A few heads turned subtle reactions from nearby passengers. The older man, however, didn't flinch. He glanced at the businessman briefly, a faint, almost imperceptible smile on his lips before turning back to the window. The lack of reaction seemed to irritate the businessman. Undeterred, he added, "What's the occasion? Did they hand out charity upgrades today?" His tone was sharper this time, laced with condescension. Still, the older man didn't take the bait. He simply adjusted his seatbelt and kept his gaze fixed on the tarmac. His silence was louder than any response he could have given, and it only fueled the businessman's arrogance. The flight attendants began their pre-flight checks, and the businessman finally leaned back, satisfied with his attempted humor. But as the plane began to taxi, something about the older man's calm demeanor began to gnaw at him. It wasn't just the silence, it was the quiet confidence, the unshakable sense of self that felt almost out of place in a world where appearances seemed to mean everything. But the businessman wasn't ready to let it go for him. The flight was just beginning, and little did he know, so was a lesson he'd never forget. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and the cabin settled into a familiar rhythm. The occasional ding of a call button, the rustling of newspapers, and the soft murmur of conversations filled the air. But the businessman seated just a row away from the older man couldn't let the interaction go. Something about the older man's presence, his calmness, his refusal to engage, felt like a challenge, though. He couldn't quite explain why he crossed one leg over the other and leaned slightly into the aisle, glancing at the man who continued to stare out the window. The businessman's lips curled into a smirk as he decided to press on. "I'm curious," he said, loud enough for a few passengers nearby to hear, "what brings someone like you to first class? Big lottery win? Or are you here to reminisce about the good old days when planes were still powered by propellers?" A few passengers exchanged glances, their discomfort evident, but no one intervened. The older man didn't react immediately, taking a slow, measured breath before turning slightly toward the businessman. For a brief moment, their eyes met. The older man's gaze was steady, unbothered, almost as though he was sizing up the younger man's intentions. Then, without saying a word, he turned back to the window, his expression as composed as ever. The lack of reaction only emboldened the businessman. He leaned back in his seat, speaking louder, now his voice dripping with mockery. "Not much for conversation, huh? I guess you'd rather sit there thinking about the days before Wi-Fi and smartphones. He chuckled to himself, his tone making it clear that he thought he'd won. Whatever imaginary battle he'd conjured, the older man again remained silent. He folded his hands neatly in his lap and adjusted the cuff of his tan jacket, a subtle movement that seemed to say, "You're not worth my time nearby." Passengers began to shift in their seats. A woman in her 50s glanced at the businessman with a look of disapproval, while a young couple sitting across the aisle whispered to each other, their eyes darting toward the older man. The tension in the cabin grew thicker, but no one stepped in to stop the scene from escalating. The businessman, oblivious to the discomfort he was causing, turned to a man sitting across the aisle, a fellow professional in a pressed suit. "You know?" He began, gesturing toward the older man. "People like to complain about progress, but I can't imagine wanting to go back to their time. No cell phones, no tech, no real innovation. How did they even survive back then?" The man across the aisle gave an uncomfortable laugh, clearly not wanting to get involved, but the businessman didn't notice or didn't care. He continued, "They always talk about how things were better, but it's just nostalgia. The world's moved on. It's better now, no matter what they say." The flight attendant approached, pushing the beverage cart down the aisle. Her professional smile slightly strained. She reached the older man's row and leaned down. "Mr. Eastwood," she said, with a warm, respectful tone, "would you like coffee or tea?" The moment the words left her mouth, the businessman froze his tablet, slipped from his hands onto his lap as the name hit him like a bolt of lightning. Eastwood, his mind raced, disbelief washing over him. Could it be? The older man turned toward the flight attendant and offered her a polite smile. "Coffee black." "Please," he said in a calm, steady voice. The businessman's jaw tightened as he processed the name, the voice and the face now taking shape in his memory. Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor and director whose reputation preceded him in every room, every space, and here he was, sitting just a row away, quietly enduring the businessman's condescension. A ripple of whispers began to spread through the cabin as passengers caught on to the revelation. "Is that really him?" one woman murmured to her husband. "I think it's Clint Eastwood," another passenger whispered excitedly. The businessman's face turned pale as the truth settled in. The man he'd been mocking wasn't just any older passenger. He was a Hollywood icon, a figure synonymous with strength, resilience, and wisdom. The gravity of his mistake hit him all at once, leaving him speechless. But the realization wasn't the end of his humiliation. It was only the beginning of a lesson that would play out in front of the entire cabin. The businessman sat frozen in his seat, the weight of recognition pressing down on him like a lead blanket. Clint Eastwood. The name echoed in his mind as he struggled to connect the dots between the iconic figure he'd grown up hearing about and the quiet man in a tan jacket who had absorbed his jabs without a single word of protest. "You don't need to explain," he said, his tone even, but firm. "What's done is done. But there's a lesson here, if you're willing to hear it." The businessman nodded quickly, his eyes wide, eager to redeem himself. The cabin seemed quiet, as if even the other passengers were waiting for what Clint Eastwood would say next. Eastwood leaned back slightly, his fingers wrapping loosely around his coffee cup. "People always think respect is something you earn by being someone important, someone with a title or a reputation." He began, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience, but real respect. That's not about who the other person is. It's about who you are. The businessman's breath caught. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Eastwood's words hit him square in the chest. The simplicity of the truth, cutting through all the excuses he'd been preparing. "You see?" Eastwood continued his gaze. "Steady respect isn't conditional. It's not something you give out based on what someone looks like, what they're wearing, or whether or not you recognize their name. It's about how you carry yourself, how you treat people, even when you think no one's watching." The businessman felt his face flush with shame. He had built his life on success and status, priding himself on being a self-made man. Yet here he was, being schooled on the most basic principle of decency by someone he had so carelessly dismissed. Eastwood took a slow sip of his coffee, then set it back down on the tray table. I've been around long enough to know that people like to make quick judgments. They think they've got someone figured out the moment they lay eyes on them. But those assumptions? He gave a slight shake of his head. They say more about the person making them than the person. They're about the businessman. Swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. He wanted to say something. Anything but the weight of his own guilt held him silent. I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad, Eastwood said, his tone softening slightly. I'm telling you because I hope you'll think about it. The next time you look at someone and decide they're worth less than you. For a moment, the cabin was completely still. The businessman sat motionless, his eyes fixed on Eastwood, who now turned back toward the window, his demeanor as calm as ever. The businessman's mind raced. He thought of all the times he had dismissed people in his life, coworkers, strangers, even friends, because they didn't fit into his narrow definition of success or relevance. How many opportunities had he missed to connect to understand because of his own arrogance? But as he sat there grappling with the weight of his own behavior, he realized that Eastwood's words weren't just a rebuke. They were an invitation to change. As the flight continued, the businessman remained silent, his thoughts churning with a mix of regret and introspection. The hum of conversation around him seemed distant. Now, a muffled backdrop to the storm inside his mind. Clint Eastwood's words echoed in his head, each sentence hitting harder the more he replayed them. Respect isn't about who the other person is. It's about who you are. He glanced again at Eastwood, who sat peacefully in his seat, looking out the window as though the entire exchange had been just another moment in a long and storied life. There was no animosity in his expression, no lingering irritation. It was as if the lesson had been given and the older man had moved on, leaving the businessman alone with his thoughts. And those thoughts were relentless. The businessman began to replay, not just this interaction, but others' moments from his life, where he'd been quick to judge, quick to dismiss. He thought about the intern he'd once ridiculed for suggesting an idea he deemed too inexperienced to understand. Months later, that same idea became a cornerstone of the company's success, though it was credited to someone else. He thought about the janitor at his office, whom he'd never bothered to greet until the day that man stopped to help him pick up scattered papers. After he'd tripped in the hallway, he thought about colleagues whose opinions he brushed aside, neighbors whose names he didn't know, strangers whose stories he never cared to hear. Each memory added to the weight in his chest, a growing realization of how his arrogance and assumptions had shaped his interactions with others. He had built a life on the belief that success and intelligence gave him the right to look down on people, to measure their worth by his own skewed standards. But Eastwood's calm words had shattered that illusion. The businessman shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He wasn't used to feeling small. He prided himself on being in control, on knowing how to command a room. Yet here he was, humbled by a man who hadn't raised his voice, hadn't argued, hadn't done anything but speak the truth. A memory from his childhood surfaced unexpectedly. He remembered his father, a strict but fair man, telling him, "Son, How you treat someone who can't do anything for you says more about your character than anything else. At the time, he had brushed the words aside, too young and self-assured. To think they applied to him now sitting in first class, with the weight of his own behavior pressing down on him, those words felt more relevant than ever. He glanced around the cabin, noticing the quiet admiration others seemed to have for Eastwood passengers, who had barely looked up from their devices earlier, were now stealing glances, whispering among themselves. But Eastwood didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he simply didn't care. His quiet confidence wasn't performative. It wasn't about commanding attention or seeking validation. It was just who he was. The businessman felt a pang of envy, not for Eastwood's fame or success, but for his sense of self. He realized that his own confidence had always been tied to external markers: his job title, his salary, his possessions. Without those things, who was? Could he still command respect? Or would he crumble under the weight of his own insecurities? He looked down at his hands, suddenly aware of how tightly he was gripping the armrests. His knuckles were white, his palms sweaty. Slowly, he released his grip and took a deep breath. There was no undoing what he had said to Eastwood, no erasing the embarrassment of this flight, but there was something he could do. He could learn for the rest of the flight. The businessman stayed quiet, his mind occupied with the implications of Eastwood's words. He thought about the kind of person he wanted to be, the kind of person who could command respect, not through power or wealth, but through kindness and humility. He didn't know if it was too late to change, but he knew he had to try. But as the plane began its descent, one thing became clear. This wasn't just another flight. It was a turning point, a moment that would stay with him long after the wheels touched the ground. As the plane began its descent, the businessman felt a familiar jolt as the landing gear deployed. The cabin lights brightened slightly, and the flight attendants made their way through the aisle, checking seatbelts and tray tables for everyone else. It was just another routine landing. But for the businessman, this flight had been anything but ordinary. He glanced out the window, the Los Angeles skyline coming into view. Normally, this sight would fill him with anticipation, a rush of energy for the meetings, deals, and opportunities waiting for him in the city. But today, it felt different. The skyline wasn't just a destination. It was a reminder of the person he had been when he boarded this flight. A man who had measured success by power and status, blind to the flaws in his character. As the plane touched down smoothly on the runway, the businessman took a deep breath, trying to steady the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him. He felt the weight of Eastwood's words still pressing on his chest. Respect isn't about who the other person is. It's about who you are. Those words had turned his world upside down, forcing him to confront truths he'd avoided for years. The cabin filled with the familiar sounds of landing. The soft chime of seatbelt signs, turning off the rustling of passengers, gathering their belongings, and the occasional chatter of those eager to disembark. The businessman moved more slowly than usual, his hands fumbling slightly as he reached for his briefcase. His mind was too preoccupied to focus on the mundane details of travel. Then he saw Clint Eastwood rise from his seat. The older man moved with a deliberate calm, retrieving his modest carry-on bag and slinging it over one shoulder as he turned to make his way toward the aisle. Eastwood paused for a moment, his gaze falling on the businessman. For a brief second, the businessman felt like a child caught doing something wrong. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, Eastwood gave him a small, knowing smile. It wasn't smug or dismissive, it was forgiving. "Take care of yourself," Eastwood said quietly, his voice carrying the same steady authority that had silenced the businessman earlier. And with that, Eastwood turned and walked toward the exit, leaving the businessman sitting there, stunned. Those simple words, spoken without malice or bitterness, carried more weight than the businessman could have anticipated. It wasn't just a farewell, it was a reminder, an invitation to be better. As the businessman finally stood and shuffled into the aisle, he noticed the way other passengers looked at Eastwood as he passed. There was admiration in their eyes, not just because of who he was, but because of how he carried himself. He didn't demand respect. He earned it through quiet strength and dignity. The businessman followed the flow of passengers through the jet bridge and into the bustling terminal. The bright lights and hum of activity felt jarring after the introspective quiet of the flight. But as he walked toward the baggage claim, the lesson he had learned stayed with him. He thought about all the times he had judged people based on appearances, status, or perceived importance. He thought about the countless opportunities he'd missed to connect with others, because he had been too wrapped up in his own ego. And he thought about the kind of person he wanted to be. Moving forward, someone who gave respect freely, not because of what someone could do for him, but because it was simply the right thing to do. When he reached the baggage claim area, he paused for a moment, pulling out his phone. His instinct was to check emails, dive back into work, and bury the uncomfortable feelings the past few hours. But instead, he opened a blank note and typed 3 simple words: "Be like Eastwood." He didn't know what the road ahead would look like, but he knew he couldn't go back to being the person he was before. That flight had changed him in ways he couldn't yet fully articulate. Because sometimes the most important lessons come not from lectures or books, but from the quiet moments when someone holds up a mirror and forces you to see yourself for who you truly are. As he left the terminal and stepped into the Los Angeles sun, the businessman felt something he hadn't felt in years: humility. And with that humility came hope. The hope that he could start again this time, with a heart more open and a mind more willing to listen. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who might need a reminder about the power of respect and humility. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire and challenge us to grow. What would you have done if you were in his shoes? Let us know in the comments below.